Good evening, everyone. Tonight, as the chill of winter settles outside and perhaps a fire crackles softly in your hearth, I invite you to step with me into a world of quiet gardens and whispered secrets. A world where appearances can be deceiving, and the most commonplace events might hide a shadow of something far more sinister. We're traveling to a quaint English village, where the spirit of Christmas is traditionally one of joy and peace, but where, this particular year, a sudden death casts a long, unsettling pall. It's a place where everyone knows everyone, or at least they think they do, and where an observant eye, like that of our esteemed Miss Jane Marple, can discern the subtle currents beneath the tranquil surface. Prepare to delve into human nature, its frailties, and its dark corners, as we unravel a mystery that will challenge your perceptions of truth and propriety. Now, let's start with the first chapter of The Death of the Old Gardener on Christmas Eve. Chapter 1: The Stillness of Christmas Morn. The air in St. Mary Mead, on that crisp Christmas morning in the early years of the 20th century, hung heavy with the promise of snow and the faint, sweet scent of wood smoke. Church bells, normally pealing with joyful abandon, offered a more subdued chime, muffled by the thick, grey sky. Villagers, bundled against the cold, hurried along the cobbled lanes, their breaths pluming like small, urgent ghosts, on their way to morning service or perhaps to deliver a forgotten festive greeting. For many, it was a day of warmth, family, and tradition. For others, particularly the household at Croft Manor, it was to become a day etched forever in a colder, bleaker memory. Miss Jane Marple, a woman whose gentle exterior belied a mind as sharp and intricate as any detective's, was enjoying a quiet breakfast in her cottage. She had risen early, as was her custom, and was contemplating the pattern of frost on her windowpane, a delicate lacework that mirrored the subtle complexities she so often observed in human affairs. The news, when it arrived, was carried by Mrs. Giles, her usually stoic housekeeper, whose face was now a mask of agitated disbelief. "Oh, Miss Marple, have you heard? Such a dreadful thing. On Christmas morning, too." Mrs. Giles wrung her hands, a rare display of emotion for her. "It's old Silas Croft, the gardener at the manor. Dead, they say. Found him in his potting shed." Miss Marple set down her teacup, the fine porcelain rattling softly against the saucer. "Silas Croft? Good heavens! How did it happen, Mrs. Giles?" Her voice was calm, but her blue eyes, though mild, held a sudden, intense focus. "Dr. Finch has been and gone. Miss says it was natural causes. A heart attack, most likely. He was an old man, after all, and prone to his coughs in the winter. Mrs. Turner, the housemaid, found him. Went down to the sheds to get some holly for the drawing room, she did, and there he was, slumped over his workbench. A terrible shock for the poor girl. Silas Croft." The name immediately conjured an image in Miss Marple's mind, a gnarled, weather-beaten man with hands like root vegetables, perpetually smelling of earth and tobacco. He had been the head gardener at Croft Manor for as long as anyone could remember, a fixture of the estate, as much a part of its landscape as the ancient yew trees he so meticulously tended. He was a man of routine, of simple habits, and possessed a gruff honesty that was both respected and occasionally, a little feared, by the villagers. His loyalty to the late Mr. Ashworth and now to his widow, Lady Ashworth, was legendary. "Natural causes, you say," Miss Marple murmured, a faint line appearing between her brows. "Well, he was certainly of an age. But Silas was a robust man for all that. He kept himself active, always out in the elements." "Did Mrs. Turner say anything else?" Mrs. Giles, eager to share the details she had gleaned from a hurried conversation with the returning Mrs. Turner, leaned in conspiratorially. "Only that it was all so peaceful, miss. He was just sitting there, as if he'd simply dozed off. His trowel was on the bench beside him, and a half-finished pot of primulas. Mrs. Turner said it was a picture, really, if not for the grim circumstance. No signs of struggle, no overturned pots, nothing amiss at all, she said. Just Silas, gone." "A half-finished pot of primulas," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. On Christmas morning. How very like Silas. She pictured the potting shed, a place of organized chaos, filled with the earthy scent of soil, the sharp tang of fertilizer, and the sweet perfume of emerging blooms. Silas took immense pride in his early blooms, a quiet competition he waged each year with the other local gardeners. The doctor's pronouncement of natural causes would, no doubt, be accepted by the village. Death came to all, and to an old man on a cold morning, it was hardly remarkable. Yet, a tiny, almost imperceptible seed of unease had been planted in Miss Marple's mind. It wasn't the death itself, nor even the timing, so much as the seemingly perfect, almost *2*perfect, scene described. Silas Croft was a man of deep-seated habits and strong principles. He was meticulous, yes, but also a creature of the earth, often leaving a trail of mud or stray leaves in his wake. And primulas, though beautiful, were not typically a Christmas Eve project for a man planning a quiet Christmas day. Miss Marple, excusing herself, rose from the table. "I think I shall take a turn later, Mrs. Giles. Perhaps I'll call upon Lady Ashworth and offer my condolences. A Christmas without Silas's expertise will be a trying one for her, I dare say." As Mrs. Giles bustled off to relay the latest village news to her sister via telephone, Miss Marple walked to her window again. The frost still clung, pristine and cold. She thought of Silas, a man of the earth, found dead amidst his work. A primula, half-potted. A tranquil scene. Too tranquil, perhaps, for a man whose life, for all its quiet routine, had always been connected to the unpredictable, often violent, forces of nature itself. There was a detail missing, a subtle discord in the harmony, that only a lifetime of observing human nature could detect. Silas, she knew, never left a job half done if he could help it. And he most certainly would not have been potting primulas at the precise moment of his departure, especially when his heart was already failing. Chapter 2, Whispers in the Parish Hall. The news of Silas Croft's passing spread through St. Mary Mead with the swiftness of a winter breeze, carried on the lips of churchgoers and market vendors alike. By the time Miss Marple attended the modest Christmas Day tea at the parish hall, the air hummed with hushed conversations and sympathetic murmurs. The scent of mulled wine and ginger biscuits was almost overshadowed by the pervasive topic, old Silas. Poor old man, Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, sighed, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. To go on Christmas morning, of all days. Though, I suppose, if one must depart, to do so peacefully in one's beloved garden, there are worse ways. Miss Marple, seated near the roaring fireplace, knitted steadily, her needles clicking a gentle counterpoint to the village gossip. She listened, her ears finely tuned to the nuances, the inflections, the unspoken details. It was in these seemingly innocent exchanges that the true fabric of the village, and its hidden threads, were revealed. He was a difficult man, mind you, offered Mr. Hemmings, the retired schoolmaster, puffing on his pipe. Set in his ways. Didn't take kindly to newfangled ideas. Remember when young Samuel Gibbs tried to convince him to plant those new hybrid roses? Silas nearly took his head off with a pruning hook. Sam Gibbs was Silas's undergardener, a younger, more ambitious man who often expressed frustration with Silas's traditional methods. He was present at the tea, looking uncharacteristically subdued, his usually ruddy face pale. Miss Marple observed him, noting how he kept glancing towards the door, as if expecting someone, or perhaps wishing for an escape. Still, he was loyal, chimed in Miss Caroline Weatherby, a spinster who lived adjacent to the manor. Lady Ashworth relied on him utterly, especially since poor Mr. Ashworth passed. Silas knew every inch of that garden, knew its temperament better than she did her own staff, I dare say. Another woman, Mrs. Long, recounted an incident from a few weeks prior. "I passed him just last month, down by the lane that leads to the old mill. He was arguing, quite heatedly, with someone I didn't recognize. A short, stout man, looked rather agitated himself. Silas was shaking his fist, which, for him, was quite a show. said something about leaving his land alone and not forgetting the past. This detail, though seemingly minor, snagged Miss Marple's attention. Silas, while gruff, was not typically prone to public displays of anger unless deeply provoked. "Did you catch anything else of the conversation, Mrs. Long?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but insistent. Mrs. Long frowned, trying to recall. Only that the man mentioned something about a boundary, and then Silas retorted, "A boundary drawn in blood, if you ask me." I thought it a peculiar expression, especially for Silas. A boundary drawn in blood. Miss Marple filed this away. Croft Manor owned a substantial amount of land, some of it undeveloped, bordering various smaller properties. Land disputes, she knew, were often at the root of simmering resentments, sometimes for generations. Young Samuel Gibbs, who had been quietly nursing a cup of tea, suddenly spoke up, his voice a little hoarse. He was acting strangely these past few weeks. Mr. Croft was more secretive than usual. Used to always leave his tools neatly put away, but lately, they'd be left out. And he spent an awful lot of time in the potting shed, even when there wasn't much to do in there. Locked it, too, sometimes, which was unheard of for him. A locked potting shed. That was another departure from Silas's usual routine. He had always been an open, if private, man when it came to his work. The idea of him locking his sanctuary, his place of quiet communion with his plants, was distinctly Silas-like. "Locked it?" Miss Marple inquired gently, her needles pausing for a moment. "Did he say why, Samuel?" Sam hesitated, then shook his head. "No, Miss Marple. Just mumbled something about the private business. I thought it odd. And he'd often burn things in the little stove in there, papers, mostly. Said he was tidying up his affairs, but it seemed a bit extreme for a man who kept every seed packet from 1901. Burning papers. Private business. A man arguing about land and boundaries. A gardener found dead on Christmas morning, in a scene of peculiar stillness, with a half-potted primula. The pieces were beginning to accumulate in Miss Marple's mind, like disparate threads waiting to be woven into a pattern. Silas Croft, the sturdy, predictable gardener, was starting to appear rather less straightforward in his final weeks. As the tea party wound down, Miss Marple noticed Sam Gibbs once more, excusing himself abruptly. He moved with a nervous energy, unlike his usual slow, deliberate gait. He seemed to be avoiding eye contact, especially with Lady Ashworth, who had just entered the hall, looking pale and drawn, accompanied by her nephew, Mr. Geoffrey Ashworth. Miss Marple watched the young undergardener disappear, a new thought forming. If Silas had been burning papers, what sort of papers might they have been? And if he had private businesses that required locking his shed, what secrets might that sanctuary have contained? The old gardener, it seemed, had been more than just a man tending plants. He had been tending a secret, and perhaps, that secret had ultimately led to his quiet, too peaceful demise. Chapter 3, A Visit to Croft Manor. The following day, Boxing Day, saw Miss Marple making her promised visit to Croft Manor. The air was colder still, and a light dusting of snow had fallen, muffling the village in a pristine, if somewhat melancholic, blanket. Croft Manor itself, a grand, if slightly faded, Georgian house, stood sentinel amidst its extensive gardens, now slumbering under the winter's hush. Lady Ashworth, a woman of refined elegance and considerable reserve, received Miss Marple in the drawing-room. Her widow's weeds, still quite fresh, lent a sombre air to her already sombre demeanour. Her nephew, Mr. Geoffrey Ashworth, a handsome young man with an air of restless charm, was also present, ostensibly offering comfort, though Miss Marple noted his frequent glances at the clock and the impatient tapping of his foot. "It is so kind of you to call, Miss Marple," Lady Ashworth said, her voice soft but strained. "This dreadful business, it has quite shattered our Christmas. Silas was like family, you know. Such a fixture." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her knitting bag resting in her lap. A truly dedicated man. The garden will miss him terribly. She observed Lady Ashworth closely. There was grief, certainly, but also a peculiar detachment, as if the whole affair was an unfortunate inconvenience rather than a profound loss. He was certainly that, Lady Ashworth agreed. Though, in truth, he had become rather intractable in his old age. Set against any changes. Geoffrey here has been trying for months to convince him to modernize some of the planting schemes, but Silas wouldn't hear of it. Geoffrey offered a wry smile. Old Silas was a formidable opponent when it came to his roses. He truly believed his methods were the only methods. Still, I admired his passion. And he was a good man, despite his stubbornness. Miss Marple caught the faint condescension in his tone. He spoke of Silas as one might speak of a quaint, but ultimately expendable, relic. The conversation drifted, touching on the funeral arrangements and the difficulties of finding a suitable replacement for Silas. Miss Marple listened politely, but her keen eyes were taking in the room, the subtle expressions on the faces of her hosts, and the echoes of the gardener's life that still permeated the house. Later, under the pretext of inquiring after Mrs. Turner, who had found the body, Miss Marple sought out the housemaid. Mrs. Turner, a nervous but talkative woman, was grateful for the distraction. Oh, Miss Marple, it was awful. The shock of it. Though, bless him, he looked so peaceful. As if he'd just drifted off. She wrung her apron, her eyes wide. But I did notice something peculiar, now that I think of it, though I didn't mention it to Dr. Finch, being all flustered at the time. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. Oh? And what was that, Mrs. Turner? Well, when I went in, the little paraffin lamp on his workbench, the one he always used in the winter, was burning. Very low, mind you, but burning. But the potting shed, Miss Marple, it smelled terribly strongly of fresh paraffin. Much more than a lamp burning low would cause. And the air was quite thick, almost heavy, with it. I opened the door wide to air it out before I called for help. A strong smell of paraffin. Miss Marple's mind immediately made a connection. Paraffin lamps, when left burning low, could sometimes give off a faint odor, but a strong smell, a thick air, suggested something more. Perhaps a spill? But Mrs. Turner had mentioned nothing being amiss, no overturned lamps or puddles. And the half-potted primula? Miss Marple asked, shifting the subject slightly, her voice gentle. Oh, yes, there it was, right beside him. A lovely little thing, just beginning to show color. You know Silas, miss, always so proud of his early blooms. Though it did seem odd to be potting it then star. He usually did his potting in the daytime, not so late that he'd need a lamp. And it was still quite early, around 8, when I found him. Early morning and a lamp still burning. A strong smell of paraffin. Miss Marple filed these details away, along with the information about Silas burning papers and locking his shed. The pieces of the puzzle were growing, becoming more defined. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple asked Mrs. Turner if she might just step out to the potting sheds to retrieve a sprig of rosemary for her own kitchen. I promised Mrs. Giles some, you see, and Silas always had the finest rosemary. It was a transparent excuse, but Mrs. Turner, still agitated, simply nodded, happy to have a brief respite from her duties. Stepping into the potting shed, Miss Marple was met with the lingering, though faint, scent of earth and, yes, a definite, though subdued, aroma of paraffin. Her eye swept over the scene. The workbench was clean, though a faint smudge of soil marked the spot where the primula pot had evidently rested. There was a small, cast-iron stove in one corner, its ashes cold. Ranks of empty pots, seed packets, and various gardening tools lined the shelves. Everything seemed meticulously in order. Too meticulously, perhaps. Silas, for all his order, was a practical man, and his working space often reflected the organic nature of his profession. Yet this shed, now, seemed almost *sanitized star. Her gaze fell upon a small, carefully placed trowel on the workbench. It was clean, polished even. Silas's favorite, no doubt. But then she noticed it, a faint, almost invisible, smear of something dark, not soil, near the handle. It was the faintest trace, easily missed. She leaned closer, her sharp eyes discerning a reddish-brown hue. It looked like dried blood. Not much, just a speck, but undeniably there. Miss Marple straightened up, her expression unreadable. Dr. Finch had pronounced the death natural. No struggle, no signs of violence. But blood? A very small amount, perhaps, but enough to cast a shadow on the doctor's initial assessment. Silas Croft, it seemed, had not simply dozed off. Something, or someone, had disturbed his peaceful Christmas Eve. Chapter 4 of The Doctor's Doubt. The tiny speck of dried blood on the trowel haunted Miss Marple. It was a detail so minute, so easily overlooked, that it spoke volumes about the care with which the scene had been tidied. Natural causes did not leave traces of blood, no matter how small, on gardening tools. She knew she couldn't present her observation as concrete evidence, it was far too ephemeral. But she could, perhaps, plant a seed of doubt. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid an unannounced visit to Dr. Finch, ostensibly to discuss a mild complaint about her own rheumatism, but with a more significant purpose in mind. Dr. Finch, a kind but somewhat overworked general practitioner, greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, good to see you, though I'm sorry to hear you're troubled." "A touch of the damp, I expect," he said, ushering her into his consulting room. "Indeed, Doctor. Though it's more than the damp that's been on my mind of late. This business with poor Silas Croft. Such a shock for the village." Dr. Finch sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Ah, yes. Tragic, but not altogether unexpected, I'm afraid. He was an old man, and his heart wasn't as strong as he liked to pretend. A sudden collapse, most likely. Peacefully, in his element." "So you said," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles already at work, creating a soothing rhythm. "But a sudden collapse, it often entails some sort of struggle, does it not? A clutching at the chest, a fall that might disturb things." Mrs. Turner described a scene of such utter stillness. A half-potted primula, a trowel neatly placed. Almost as if he had simply laid down his work and closed his eyes. But even in a peaceful heart attack, there's usually some sign, isn't there? A slight gasp, a tremor, a dislodged item. Dr. Finch paused, his brows furrowing slightly. He respected Miss Marple's quiet intelligence, knowing her observations were often surprisingly astute. "Well, yes, ideally one might expect some disarray. But not always. The human body is unpredictable, Miss Marple. Sometimes it simply gives out, with barely a whisper." And the paraffin lamp, burning so low, yet Mrs. Turner described a very strong smell of paraffin when she entered the shed. "Enough to make the air thick," she said. "Does that strike you as entirely consistent, Doctor? A lamp burning low should emit very little smell, surely." This point clearly gave Dr. Finch pause. He had not been privy to Mrs. Turner's more detailed description of the smell, having been focused on the immediate medical assessment. "A strong smell of paraffin, you say? That is interesting. I did note a faint odor, of course, but nothing out of the ordinary for a working shed. Perhaps the lamp was newer, or had been recently refilled." "Perhaps," Miss Marple conceded, her tone mild. "But it was still burning, and the air was thick." "And what of the time, Doctor?" Mrs. Turner found him quite early on Christmas morning, around 8 o'clock. If he had been potting primulas late on Christmas Eve, with a lamp, and then suffered a heart attack, the lamp would have burned for many hours. Would it not have consumed a significant amount of paraffin? Or perhaps even gone out? Dr. Finch was now genuinely thoughtful. You raise a good point, Miss Marple. I didn't consider the lamp's state of consumption. I simply noted it was alight. A lamp burning low for several hours, especially a small one like those used in sheds, would indeed burn through its fuel. If it was still burning at 8 a.m., it suggests it was either recently lit, or had a very full reservoir. He paced his consulting room, a new expression of unease on his face. You know, Miss Marple, now that you mention it, when I examined the body, I did notice a very faint mark. A small, almost imperceptible scratch, just above his left ear. I put it down to an accidental scrape from a branch or a tool. It certainly wasn't a cause of death, too minor for that, and there was no blood. He stopped pacing, turning to face her. But if there was a struggle, however brief, or if he fell onto something specific, Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his. Indeed. And a man of Silas's age and constitution, even if his heart was weak, would likely have shown some other signs. Perhaps a bump, a bruise, even a small cut from a fall, if it was truly accidental, onto a hard floor or against a workbench edge. Dr. Finch ran a hand through his hair again, a look of growing consternation on his face. You've certainly given me food for thought, Miss Marple. A small scratch, a strong paraffin smell, a lamp burning low, and a scene of unnatural stillness. Perhaps a more thorough examination is warranted. I should inform the constable, just to be on the safe side, and request a post-mortem, though Lady Ashworth will not be pleased. Miss Marple offered a small, knowing smile. It is always best to be thorough, Doctor. Even with the most straightforward of cases, human nature has a way of introducing complexities. As she left, the crisp winter air felt sharper, the mystery deeper. The doctor, initially convinced, was now plagued by doubt. Her gentle prodding had worked. The primula, the paraffin, the scratch, they were no longer isolated curiosities but threads beginning to tighten around the edges of a different, more disturbing picture. Silas Croft's peaceful death was about to become less peaceful, and far more scrutinized. Chapter 5, The Estranged Daughter. The news of a more thorough investigation into Silas Croft's death, spearheaded by a now dubious Dr. Finch and a newly engaged Constable Evans, rippled through St. Mary Mead. It added a frisson of scandal to the already somber Christmas season. Whispers of foul play, once dismissed as morbid fancy, now found fertile ground in the village's collective imagination. It was against this backdrop that Martha Croft, Silas's only daughter, arrived in St. Mary Mead. She was a woman in her late 30s, with her father's rugged features softened by a weary resignation. She had left the village years ago, following a bitter disagreement with Silas over her choice of husband, a cheerful but feckless painter named Thomas, whom Silas had deemed entirely unsuitable. Her visits to her father had been sporadic and strained, usually limited to a brief, obligatory call on his birthday or at Christmas. Miss Marple encountered Martha at the general store, where she was making arrangements for a modest wreath. Martha looked thinner than Miss Marple remembered, her eyes shadowed with a grief that seemed less about the immediate loss and more about years of unspoken words. Miss Marple, Martha acknowledged, her voice tight. You've heard, of course, about father. Indeed, my dear. My deepest sympathies. It is a dreadful shock. Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. I imagine it must be particularly difficult for you, given the circumstances. Martha's lips pressed into a thin line. Difficult, yes. I always hoped, well, one always hopes for reconciliation, doesn't one? For the chance to say what needs to be said. And now, it's too late. She sighed, a profound weariness settling upon her. He was a stubborn man, my father. As hard as the earth he tended. But he loved that garden, and he loved his work. He did, Miss Marple agreed, her gaze unwavering. And he seemed to be working right up to the end. Mrs. Turner found him with a half-potted primula. A primula? Martha's brow furrowed. That is odd. Father always finished what he started. And primulas, they weren't his particular passion. Roses, yes. Orchids, occasionally. But primulas were more for general bedding. She paused, a new thought emerging. Actually, now that I think of it, he had started growing some very unusual varieties of primulas this past year. Exotic, even. Said they were for a special project. Wouldn't tell me more, just that they were very particular, and required specific care. A special project involving unusual primulas. This was another thread. Silas, the traditionalist, venturing into exotic blooms. It seemed out of character, yet also hinted at a new preoccupation. Did your father have any other special projects recently, Martha? Miss Marple asked, her voice light, as if making idle conversation. Any new interests, or concerns? Martha hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window. He was always a private man, Miss Marple. But yes, there was something. About a month ago, he sent me a letter. A proper letter, mind you, not just a postcard. It was quite unlike him. He wrote that he had come into some information, something that was not right, and that he felt a great burden of conscience. He hinted that it involved the manor, and perhaps some old business that had never been properly settled. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. Old business? Related to the manor. He was vague, Martha continued, her voice lower now. Said he was trying to verify it, to make sure he had all his facts straight before he'd stirred up a hornet's nest. He mentioned he'd found something in some old ledgers, or papers, I think. And he said he was very worried about someone, but wouldn't say who. Just that he had to be careful, as they were powerful people. Old ledgers or papers. A hornet's nest. Powerful people. This was a significant revelation. It corroborated the whispers about Silas burning papers and locking his shed, suggesting he was not merely tidying his affairs, but actively investigating something sensitive and potentially dangerous. Did he ever mention this again, Martha? Miss Marple pressed gently. Or give you any clue as to what this fold businesses might entail? Martha shook her head, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. No. I wrote back, of course, asking him to explain. But his reply was brief, just that he was still looking into it and that I shouldn't worry my head. The next thing I knew was the telegram about his death. She looked up, her eyes wide. Do you think, Miss Marple, that this fold businesses could have something to do with what happened? Miss Marple merely offered a sympathetic look. It is certainly a possibility, my dear. Secrets, like weeds, can grow in the most unexpected places, and sometimes they entangle themselves with great force. As Martha continued to dab her eyes, Miss Marple's mind was racing. Silas Croft, the loyal gardener, had been digging into secrets, not just in the earth, but in the hidden past of Croft Manor itself. He had found something in old papers, something that troubled his conscience and put him in opposition to powerful people. The fight over land Mrs. Long had overheard, the locked shed, the burning papers, the unusual primulas, they were all beginning to coalesce around a central, disturbing idea. Silas Croft had stumbled upon a truth that someone desperately wanted to keep buried. And that truth, it seemed, had ultimately cost him his life. Chapter 6, An Old Grievance. The post-mortem examination, requested by a now thoroughly convinced Dr. Finch, was conducted with discreet urgency. The initial findings, quietly relayed to Constable Evans and then to Miss Marple, confirmed what she had already suspected. Silas Croft had indeed suffered a heart attack, but the manner of death was not entirely unnatural. Silas Croft had not died peacefully in his sleep, he had been incapacitated and then suffered a fatal cardiac event, likely exacerbated by the struggle. Murder. The word hung in the cold air, unspoken but understood. Constable Evans, now fully alert, began a more formal investigation, revisiting witnesses, and taking statements with renewed intensity. Miss Marple, meanwhile, turned her attention to the old businesses Martha had mentioned. She recalled Mrs. Long's account of Silas arguing about a boundary line, using the phrase "a boundary drawn in blood." This cryptic remark, combined with the mention of old ledgers and a powerful people, suggested a long-standing, perhaps generational, dispute. Her thoughts turned to the history of Croft Manor. It had been in the Ashworth family for centuries. However, about 30 years prior, a significant portion of the surrounding land had been sold off to fund renovations after a period of financial difficulty. This land, a wooded area bordering the old mill stream, had since been developed into a small cluster of cottages and a local timber yard. Miss Marple remembered a particular incident from her youth, a bitter legal battle over an ancient right-of-way that had divided the village. It involved the Ashworths and a family named Davies, who owned the land where the timber yard now stood. The Davies family had claimed ancestral rights to a path cutting directly through what was then Ashworth land. The dispute had been notoriously acrimonious, ending with the Davies family losing and eventually selling their remaining property and leaving the village, disgraced and financially ruined. Could this be the old businesses? Was someone from the Davies family, or their descendants, back in the village? Miss Marple decided a visit to the local archives, located in the vicarage, might yield some answers. The vicar, Reverend Clement, was only too happy to assist the dear old lady. Sifting through dusty parish records, ancient maps, and property deeds, Miss Marple uncovered a fascinating detail. The original deed for the Croft Manor land, dating back over 2 centuries, contained a highly specific clause regarding a particular small plot of land near the mill stream, the very area where the timber yard now stood. This plot was to revert to the Davies family line under certain, highly improbable, conditions, namely, if the Ashworth line ever failed completely **** if the Davies family could prove direct, uninterrupted lineage to the original claimant. It was a relic of an old, feudal agreement, practically unenforceable. But then, another detail. A recent amendment, quietly added to the Ashworth family trust 15 years prior, explicitly reaffirmed the Ashworths' ownership of all land, with a specific, though subtle, deletion of the ancient Davies clause. This amendment had been overseen by a solicitor from London, not the local firm. This was intriguing. Why reaffirm something so obscure, unless there was a reason? Unless someone was concerned about a challenge? Miss Marple also noticed something else in the records, a recent visit to the archives by a Mr. Alastair Finch. Not Dr. Finch, but a distant cousin, a solicitor from London who had been involved in property law. And what was more, Mr. Alastair Finch had been staying with his cousin, Dr. Finch, in St. Mary Mead, just before Christmas. A short, stout man, Mrs. Long had described Silas arguing with. As Miss Marple contemplated this, she also considered Samuel Gibbs, the under-gardener. He had been unusually quiet and restless since Silas's death. Constable Evans had informed Miss Marple that Sam had recently requested a large loan from the village bank, citing a sudden family emergency. He also mentioned that Sam had a history of making rash decisions when under financial pressure. Could Sam be involved in this bold businesses? Perhaps he was being coerced, or had been promised something. Just as she was about to leave the archives, Reverend Clement mentioned, almost as an afterthought, "Oh, Miss Marple, I nearly forgot. Young Sam Gibbs was in here not a week ago, asking to see some old maps of the manor property. Said Silas had asked him to, for some new landscaping project. I found it a bit odd, as Silas was always meticulous about those things himself." Sam Gibbs looking at old maps. Silas burning papers. A land dispute. A strong smell of paraffin. A small scratch, a sedative, and a heart attack. The threads were tightening, beginning to weave a pattern far more intricate and disturbing than a simple heart attack. It seemed Silas Croft had not only uncovered a secret, but that secret was deeply rooted in the very land he tended, and someone, perhaps from the past, was willing to kill to protect it. Chapter 7, The Curious Case of the Missing Item. The formal investigation, now led by Inspector Davies from the County Constabulary, a man of sharp mind, though initially dismissive of Miss Marple's subtle suggestions, began to make progress. The post-mortem findings were made public, sending a ripple of shock through St. Mary Mead. Silas Croft, it was now confirmed, had been murdered. The sedative, administered subtly, had weakened him, leading to the struggle and the fatal heart attack. Inspector Davies, a man of methodical deduction, focused on the shed. He ordered a more thorough forensic examination, which confirmed the faint traces of blood Miss Marple had observed, identifying it as Silas's. The strong smell of paraffin was attributed to a small amount having been spilled near the lamp, though no obvious spill mark remained. The lamp itself, when tested, showed a significant reduction in its fuel, indicating it had burned for many hours. So, someone was in there for a long time on Christmas Eve, Inspector Davies concluded to Constable Evans, his voice grave. Long enough to administer the sedative, wait for it to take effect, and then stage the scene. Miss Marple, who had been granted a quiet consultation with the inspector due to her local knowledge and uncanny insights, listened attentively. "And what of the missing items, Inspector?" she inquired gently. Inspector Davies looked at her, surprised. "Missing items, Miss Marple? We've found nothing to suggest anything missing from the shed or Mr. Croft's cottage. A few small personal effects, perhaps, but nothing of note." "But there is something," Miss Marple insisted, "or at least, there ought to be. Mrs. Turner mentioned the half-potted primula. And Martha Croft mentioned her father had a special project involving very unusual, exotic primulas. He was a creature of routine, and meticulously organized. He would not have left something half done, nor would he have had an exotic primula without a label, or a specific pot, or perhaps a small, specialized tool for its care." The inspector raised an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism in his expression. "A missing plant label? Really, Miss Marple, are we to believe a plant label is key to a murder inquiry?" "It might not be the label itself, Inspector," Miss Marple explained patiently, "but what it represents. If Silas was involved in a special project with these exotic primulas, and he was found with one half-potted, it stands to reason that there would be some record of it. A specific seed packet, a cultivation note, a unique pot. Something that would set these particular plants apart from the others." Inspector Davies, though still slightly unconvinced, made a note. Later, he sent Constable Evans back to the potting shed and Silas's cottage. A thorough search, guided by Mrs. Turner and Martha Croft, revealed nothing obviously missing. The shed seemed complete. However, Mrs. Turner, after much thought, did recall something. "You know, now that Miss Marple mentions it, Mr. Croft had a small, very old wooden box. He kept it on a shelf above his workbench. Always locked. He said it contained special secrets for his rarest plants. I never saw what was in it, but he always kept it close. And I don't see it now. A small, old, locked wooden box. This was far more significant than a plant label." Constable Evans returned to the shed, and indeed, the small indentation on the dusty shelf where such a box might have sat was empty. "What was in it?" Inspector Davies asked Mrs. Turner. "I really don't know, sir," she said, wringing her hands. "But he was always very particular about it. Never let anyone touch it. Martha Croft, too, confirmed the box's existence. Yes, I remember it. He said it contained his most precious gardening secrets, inherited from his father. Old strains of seeds, rare plant cuttings. But he also hinted once that it contained other things that had nothing to do with plants, but everything to do with the land itself." "Other things, and the land," Miss Marple murmured. "Could this box have contained the old ledgers or papers Martha mentioned? The ones concerning the cold businesses at the manor?" Inspector Davies's eyes narrowed. "A missing box, containing potentially vital documents regarding a land dispute, and Silas Croft is murdered. This is no longer about plant labels, Miss Marple. This is a motive. He paused, looking at his notes. And what of Mr. Alastair Finch, the London solicitor? Dr. Finch confirmed his cousin was indeed staying with him over Christmas, and that he had a keen interest in historical property law. He also confirms Alastair is a short, stout man. The pieces clicked into place for Miss Marple. Alastair Finch, the solicitor who had added the amendment to the Ashworth Trust, quietly deleting the Davies clause. Silas Croft, discovering some truth in old papers, troubled by his conscience, arguing with a short, stout man about a boundary drawn in blood. The old Davies family grievance, potentially rekindled. And now, a missing, locked box that likely contained the very proof Silas had uncovered. The motive was beginning to solidify, not a simple robbery, nor a personal vendetta, but a deeply buried secret, tied to wealth, property, and a very old injustice, that someone was desperate to keep hidden. Silas Croft, the loyal gardener, had become too close to a truth that could unravel everything for someone powerful. The missing box, it was clear, was the key to unlocking the true identity of the killer. Chapter 8: The Christmas Guest Secret. With the revelation of the missing box, Inspector Davies's investigation at Croft Manor intensified. Every corner of the potting shed, Silas's cottage, and even parts of the manor house itself were searched, but the box was nowhere to be found. The village buzzed with theories, now that murder was officially acknowledged. The focus shifted from the who to the why, and then back again, with renewed urgency. Miss Marple, meanwhile, began to reconsider all the characters involved, sifting through their actions and words with a discerning eye. Lady Ashworth, reserved and proper. Geoffrey Ashworth, the restless nephew, standing to inherit. Mrs. Turner, the housemaid, nervous but seemingly honest. Samuel Gibbs, the undergardener, ambitious and financially troubled. And then there was Mr. Alastair Finch, the London solicitor, a man of property law, a cousin to the village doctor, and the one Silas Croft was last seen arguing with. But there was one other, a less obvious figure, who had been at Croft Manor over Christmas, Lady Ashworth's brother, Mr. Peregrine Thorne. A quiet, scholarly man of about 60, an antiquarian book dealer, who had arrived a few days before Christmas and was staying until after New Year's. He was a man of unassuming presence, rarely venturing beyond the manor's extensive library, seemingly absorbed in his books. Miss Marple had met him briefly at the parish hall tea. He had said little, merely nodding politely, and had seemed entirely unconnected to the village's undercurrents. However, a detail from Martha Croft's account resurfaced in Miss Marple's mind. Silas had hinted that the old business involved the manor and possibly powerful people he was trying to protect. Could Mr. Peregrine Thorne, with his scholarly interest and quiet nature, have a hidden connection to the Ashworth family's old secrets? Miss Marple decided a second, more pointed conversation with Mrs. Turner might be fruitful. Mrs. Turner, still unnerved by the murder, was surprisingly open. Mr. Thorne, you mean? Lady Ashworth's brother? He's a quiet one, bless him. Always with his nose in a book. Hardly noticed he was here, really, until just before Christmas Eve. Just before Christmas Eve. Miss Marple prompted. Did something unusual happen then? Mrs. Turner hesitated, then nodded. Well, yes. That morning, I saw him coming out of the head gardener's cottage, Mr. Croft's, that is. I thought it odd, as Mr. Thorne rarely went out there. He had a small, rather old-looking leather satchel with him, which he usually kept locked in his room, but he looked quite flustered, miss. And he nearly ran into Mr. Croft himself, who was just coming up the path from the sheds. And what did Mr. Croft say? Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but her eyes sharp. Oh, he just said something about Mr. Thorne being our busy bee, and Mr. Thorne just muttered something about research. But Mr. Croft, he looked rather put out, miss. And then, I remember, he spent the rest of the day in his potting shed, not coming out much, even for his lunch. Peregrine Thorne, a quiet scholar, caught leaving Silas's cottage with a locked satchel, looking flustered, just before Silas retreated to his shed for the day, burning papers and locking the door. And Silas then being murdered in that very shed on Christmas Eve. The connection was chilling. Miss Marple also recalled Martha Croft's earlier comment: Silas had received a letter that deeply troubled him, and he mentioned finding something in old ledgers or papers regarding an old business at the manor. Could Peregrine Thorne, the antiquarian book dealer, have been the one to introduce or even possess some of these old documents, perhaps innocently, perhaps not? Miss Marple also learned from Mrs. Turner that Peregrine Thorne had a peculiar habit: he always locked his study door in the manor when he was inside, even when reading, a detail not entirely uncommon for a scholar, but which Miss Marple found curious in the context of the manor's generally open household. Later that evening, Miss Marple passed Mr. Peregrine Thorne in the lane, returning from a solitary walk. He greeted her politely, his usual gentle smile in place. But Miss Marple, with her extraordinary intuition, noticed a flicker in his eyes, a momentary shadow of deep-seated anxiety that belied his placid expression. And for the briefest moment, she caught the faint, unmistakable scent of old parchment and leather emanating from him, not merely the scent of an antiquarian, but something richer, older, like papers that had been handled for a long, long time, perhaps in secret. She now suspected Mr. Peregrine Thorne was not just a quiet Christmas guest. He was intimately connected to the old business and the missing box. His presence in Silas's cottage, his flustered appearance, his locked satchel, and the scent of old papers all pointed to him having a critical, possibly incriminating, role in the unfolding drama. Silas, it seemed, had discovered not just a secret about the land, but a secret about the Ashworth family itself, a secret that Peregrine Thorne, the quiet scholar, was deeply embroiled in, and perhaps, was desperate to keep hidden. Chapter 9: The Truth's Gentle Unfurling. The atmosphere at Croft Manor was thick with unspoken tension. Inspector Davies had called a meeting in the drawing-room, gathering Lady Ashworth, Geoffrey Ashworth, Samuel Gibbs, Mrs. Turner, and Mr. Peregrine Thorne. Miss Marple was also present, having been invited by the inspector, who had, by now, developed a grudging respect for her insights. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows, but offered little warmth against the chill of the truth that was about to be revealed. Inspector Davies began, methodically recounting the known facts: Silas Croft's murder, the sedative, the blow to the head, the staged scene, the missing box. He then turned to Miss Marple, a silent invitation for her to speak. Miss Marple, her knitting in her lap, began in her gentle, conversational tone, as if simply sharing observations about village life. It always struck me as odd, the circumstances of Silas's passing. So very peaceful for a man found dead unexpectedly. And a half-potted primula on Christmas Eve. Silas, for all his traditional ways, was cultivating an exotic, unusual variety of primula, a special project as his daughter Martha described it. She paused, looking around the room, her gaze resting briefly on each person. Silas, you see, was a creature of the earth. He understood its cycles, its hidden life. But he also understood human nature, which, I dare say, is often far more complex than any plant. She continued, weaving together the threads. Martha told us Silas had found some old papers or ledgers concerning the manor, something not right. Mrs. Long saw him arguing with a short, stout man about a boundary drawn in blood. And we know Mr. Alastair Finch, a solicitor specializing in property law, a short, stout man, was staying in the village, and he had previously been involved in an amendment to the Ashworth Trust, quietly deleting an ancient clause that related to the Davies family and a claim on this very land. Geoffrey Ashworth shifted uncomfortably, and Lady Ashworth looked away. Peregrine Thorne remained impassive, his hands clasped. Silas, with his acute sense of justice and his deep knowledge of the manor's history, had clearly stumbled upon a truth, Miss Marple continued. A truth connected to the Davies family's old grievance, and a possible claim on the land. He was verifying his facts, gathering evidence. This is why he was burning papers, not to destroy his own affairs, but perhaps to discreetly dispose of copies he no longer needed, or to make it seem as if he was just tidying up. And why he locked his shed, to protect his private business, as Samuel Gibbs observed. Samuel Gibbs, who had been sitting hunched, suddenly sat straighter, a flicker of fear in his eyes. The missing box, Miss Marple went on, her voice gaining a quiet authority that Silas kept above his workbench, containing special secrets and other things to do with the land. This box, I believe, contained the original documents, the proof of Silas's discovery. She turned her gaze directly to Mr. Peregrine Thorne. And it was you, Mr. Thorne, who was seen leaving Silas's cottage, looking flustered, with your locked leather satchel, just before Silas retreated to his shed for the day. And you, an antiquarian book dealer, possess a keen interest in old documents. The scent of old parchment and leather, quite distinct, seemed to cling to you that day. Peregrine Thorne blanched, but still said nothing. Silas, it seems, discovered that the Ashworth family, perhaps unknowingly at first, was holding on to land that, according to ancient, forgotten covenants, rightfully belonged to the descendants of the Davies family. The specific clause, quietly removed from the Ashworth Trust by Alastair Finch, was the key. Silas discovered that the conditions for the land reverting to the Davies line might actually have been met, or were close to being met, and that the quiet removal of that clause was a deliberate act to obscure this. But what does this have to do with me? Peregrine Thorne finally spoke, his voice reedy. I merely assist Lady Ashworth with cataloguing some old family texts. Ah, but you are not merely an antiquarian, Mr. Thorne, Miss Marple replied, her eyes unwavering. You are Lady Ashworth's brother. And you are a man of books, yes, but also a man of considerable intellect and, dare I say, cunning. You would have been the one, perhaps, to initially stumble upon the old covenants within the family library, or among the family papers, perhaps while researching for your sister. You would have understood the implications immediately. A challenge to the family's wealth, its standing, its very ownership of the manor's lands. And you would have sought to protect your family's legacy, by any means. She continued, her voice soft, but each word a hammer blow. You would have brought the matter to Mr. Alastair Finch, your cousin, knowing his expertise. Together, you orchestrated the quiet removal of the clause, believing the matter settled. But then, Silas, independently, stumbled upon the truth. Perhaps he found his own copies of the old documents, or deciphered clues from the land itself, or even through the unique primulas he was growing, a very specific, rare type of primula, perhaps one associated with the Davies family, or a specific, forgotten plot of land that was key to the old boundaries. Silas, a man of conscience, decided he could not let this injustice stand. He had the old box, containing the proof. He intended to reveal the truth, perhaps after Christmas. But you, Mr. Thorne, must have learned of his intentions. Perhaps Silas confided in you, or you overheard something, or saw the documents yourself when you entered his cottage that morning. You realized the enormity of the threat to your family. You knew Silas would not be swayed. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. So, on Christmas Eve, you went to the potting shed. You administered the sedative, perhaps in a cup of tea or cocoa, knowing Silas was alone. When he was disoriented, you confronted him. There was a brief struggle, a blow to the head, a heart attack. You then meticulously staged the scene, making it look like a natural death, even leaving the half-potted primula as a final, ironic touch of peace. You cleaned the trowel, wiped away all but the faintest trace of blood, knowing no one would suspect. And you took the box, the evidence, and concealed it. A profound silence filled the room. Peregrine Thorne's face was ashen, his scholarly composure crumbling. He looked like an old man suddenly stripped bare. You, Mr. Thorne, Miss Marple concluded gently, were protecting your family's legacy, but in doing so, you extinguished a life and buried a truth. The truth of Silas Croft's murder, and the truth he died trying to expose. Chapter 10, Revelation and Resolution. The silence that followed Miss Marple's quiet, yet devastating, exposition was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant chiming of the village clock. Peregrine Thorne sat utterly still, his earlier pallor now replaced by a ghastly grey. He made no sudden movements, no protests, no denials. His shoulders slumped, and he looked suddenly frail, all the scholarly dignity drained from him. Lady Ashworth stared at her brother, a look of profound shock and horror on her face, while Geoffrey Ashworth had turned away, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Inspector Davies moved swiftly. "Mr. Thorne, do you have anything to say in response to Miss Marple's accusations?" Peregrine Thorne finally stirred, letting out a long, shuddering breath. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. He wouldn't listen. Silas was determined to expose us. To ruin everything. He paused, his eyes glazing over as if reliving the moment. I went to him. Tried to reason. I knew he kept the original deeds in that box. I needed to ensure they were gone. He found me trying to retrieve it. He fought. He called me a thief, a deceiver, and then, he grasped at his chest. I administered the sedative earlier, yes, in his tea. Just to make him amenable. I never intended, his voice trailed off, lost in a choked sob. I never intended for it to go this far. He buried his face in his hands, his confession a quiet, broken testament to a desperate act. The police officers, who had been waiting quietly in the hall, stepped forward and took Peregrine Thorne into custody. The quiet scholar, driven by a misguided sense of loyalty and a fear of ruin, had committed murder to protect an ancient secret. The missing box, it was later found, had been hidden in a false bottom of Peregrine Thorne's locked leather satchel, filled with the very documents Silas Croft had died to protect, original land deeds, copies of the Davies family's lineage, and correspondence detailing the forgotten clauses. The rare primulas Silas was cultivating were indeed a specific strain, unique to the original Davies plot, an identifier he was using to solidify his claim. The old business had been a long-buried land dispute, potentially worth a substantial fortune, which, if exposed, would have severely impacted the Ashworth family's wealth and reputation. Alastair Finch, the other solicitor, was also implicated for his role in deliberately obscuring the truth. Life in St. Mary Mead slowly began to return to its rhythms, but the memory of that Christmas Eve, and the quiet man who tended the manor's gardens, would linger. The tranquil surface of village life had been irrevocably disturbed, revealing the dark currents beneath. Miss Marple, back in her own quiet cottage, reflected on the affair. Such a pity, she murmured to Mrs. Giles, who was finally able to absorb the full, shocking truth. Human nature, you see, Mrs. Giles. Even the most seemingly gentle souls can be driven to desperate acts when faced with the loss of what they hold dear, be it reputation